EPA, here's what they have to say, but they do their own analysis of the cost to do the regulation. So I would urge support for this amendment. Leave the bill if you want it, but don't give that veto power to DOE. I reserve the balance of my time if I have
The gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Kentucky seek recognition?
Madam Chairman, I rise in opposition to the gentleman's amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. As the gentleman said, his amendment would in effect strike the provisions preventing EPA from finalizing rules that this Energy Secretary determined will cause significant adverse effects to the economy. And that's precisely why I respectfully oppose the gentleman's amendment. All of the debate this afternoon is focused on how EPA is focused totally on health benefits. And health benefits are vitally important. We recognize that. I think I also pointed out from experts that EPA makes mistakes in their benefit analysis, in their cost analysis when they look at cost. And so once again, what we're trying to do with the Cassidy bill is look at health, yes, but what is the impact on jobs? What is the impact on those families who lose a job because of the regulation? What is the impact on the children of the family who loses the job because of the regulation? What is the effect on their ability to provide the needs for their family, their health insurance, their food, and so forth? So all we're saying is that the Secretary of Energy in the same cabinet as the administrator of the EPA would head up an analysis to review the EPA rule that exceeds $1 billion and affects energy alone. And if they decide that it will have significant adverse impact on the economy, then they can stop it. And by the way, under the legislation, EPA would also have to give a report to Congress on the impact on energy, the cost, how much will they go up on gasoline, on electricity, how many jobs will be lost, how many jobs will be created. So when we have a struggling economy, the last thing we want to do is to create additional obstacles that really are not necessary at a time when you can do other things and protect health also. So with that, I would respectfully oppose the gentleman's amendment and ask that members vote against the gentleman's amendment, and I would yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Kentucky yields back the balance of time. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from California. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
Madam Chair.
The gentleman from California.
I demand a roll call vote on the amendment.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from California will be postponed. The chair understands that amendment number 2 will not be offered. It is now in order to consider amendment number 3, printed in Part B of House Report 113-174. For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia seek recognition?
Madam Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 3, printed in Part B of House Report number 113-174, offered by Mr. Connolly of Virginia.
Pursuant to House Resolution 315, the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Virginia.
I thank the chair, and at this time I am pleased to recognize my co-author of this amendment, Mr. Kildee from Michigan, for 2.5 minutes.
The gentleman from Michigan is recognized for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to my friend Mr. Connolly for his leadership and for working on this amendment with me. I represent nearly 100 miles of Great Lakes shoreline. When I ran for Congress, I made a commitment to my constituents in the 5th District that I would fight every day to create jobs, to strengthen the economy, and to protect our precious water resources. Our amendment would do just that. In Michigan, we know the value well of clean water. since we are surrounded by the largest bodies of surface fresh water on Earth, the Great Lakes. As a kid, I spent many summer weekends with my family at a city campground in East Tawas, a lakefront city that I now have the privilege of representing in Congress. Our amendment would protect our precious waters from pollution. Without our amendment, today's legislation would put the safety of Great Lakes, of our lakes and waterways, in jeopardy. History has repeatedly taught us what polluters will do if left unregulated. We've seen disastrous oil spills, including the Enbridge oil spill in Michigan, that threaten our state and our nation's natural resources. I will not sit idly by and allow the very rules that protect towns like East Tawas and Tawas City, Oscoda, Bay City, Eau Gray, and other towns in my district to be tossed aside for political expediency. This bill, as written, would give the EPA would give the Department of Energy unprecedented power to veto EPA rules that protect public health, save lives, and protect the Great Lakes. Our amendment would prevent the DOE from being able to veto rules that regulate air or water quality. I've heard a lot of discussion about jobs. Michigan's Great Lakes are an economic asset for my state, supporting 1.5 million jobs and pumping over $62 billion into our economy. These jobs in Michigan's recreational economy depend on clean water for fishing, for swimming, for drinking. We must protect them from pollution and harm. Today's legislation is clearly misguided and fails to provide necessary tools to protect our nation's critical natural resources. Republicans in committee have already voted to decrease funding for the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative by almost 80%, something that I strongly oppose, and now they want to make it easier for polluters to poison our waters. I will fight these bad proposals every day I'm in Congress. I urge my colleagues to support our common-sense amendment to protect the Great Lakes and protect our natural waterways. I yield back.
Has
Thank you.
expired. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized. For what
Thank you,
purpose?
Madam Chairman. I rise in opposition to the gentleman's
The
amendment.
gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
No, I would say, first of all, with all due respect, that certainly we have no intent of trying to pollute additionally the waterways that the gentleman referred to in Michigan. And I rise to oppose his amendment simply because he would say that this legislation would not apply to any rule that relates to air quality or water quality. So this amendment would exclude virtually all EPA rules from the transparency and interagency review requirements of the Act. And I would just summarize once again. We're talking about energy-related rules that exceed $1 billion. We know that EPA looks closely at health benefits, health impacts, and we certainly favor that. But that's not the only thing that should be examined, and that's what this legislation is about. The Secretary of Energy, with other cabinet officials in the Obama administration, would look at the impact of the regulation on the cost of electricity, the cost of gasoline, how many jobs might be lost, how many jobs might be created, would it have significant adverse impact to the economy as a whole. And I would think that everyone would say, if it does, particularly with the slow economic growth we have today, the last 15 quarters have been the slowest since World War II, and the last quarter of 2012, the first quarter of 2013, the gross domestic product increased less than 2%. So we need to take special attention, provide special attention to the impact that regulations may have on creating job loss and the impact on those families that lose those jobs. And that's what the gentleman's legislation is all about. And I know the gentleman rose with the very best intentions, but I would respectfully oppose his amendment and ask members to defeat his amendment. And with that, I would yield back the balance of my time.
From Kentucky yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
I thank the Chair. I rise to join my colleague, Mr. Kildee from Michigan, in offering what I think is a common-sense amendment that protects public health and safety. I didn't think it was possible, Madam Chair, but but this bill may actually be worse than the anti-regulatory legislation Republicans ran through the last Congress. The House majority calls this latest version the Energy Consumers Relief Act, an Orwellian name if there ever was one, deceptively titled as Congress heads for recess, but the title does not reflect reality. This bill might more aptly be called the Blocking Public Health Protections Act. Shamefully, this is yet another attempt by the majority to gut public health and safety protections so they can give more handouts to big energy producers, many of which, of course, have financed the majority in this House. Not only does this bill block or delay the EPA from finalizing rules, Madam Chairman, to reduce pollution that threatens the air we breathe and the water we drink, it also gives unprecedented power, as the distinguished ranking member of the committee pointed out, to the Department of Energy to veto EPA rules. Nonsensical and a non sequitur if there ever was one. We know rules already in place, like the mercury and air toxic standards, that effectively regulate carcinogens, neurotoxins, smog and soot pollution, prevent up to 11,000 premature deaths, 47 heart attacks, and 130,000 asthma attacks every year. So I ask my colleagues, why are we trying to prevent proven protections on public health? Our amendment will continue to put public health first by ensuring that EPA retains that authority to implement the vital safeguards that protect air and water quality that previous generations in this House on a bipartisan basis believed were necessary and important to protect the public we serve. And with that, I yield back, Madam Chair.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Madam Chair, I move that the committee do now rise.
The gentleman will suspend. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Virginia. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not. Gentleman from Virginia.
Thank you, Madam Chair. On that matter, I would request a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Virginia will be postponed. What purpose does the gentleman from Kentucky seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I move now that the committee do rise.
The question is on the motion that the committee rise. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no. The ayes have it. The motion is adopted. Accordingly, the committee rises. I'm closed.
House will be in order, Madam Chair.
Mr. Speaker, the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union, having had under consideration H.R. 1582, directs me to report that it has come to no resolution thereon.
Chair of the Committee on the Whole House of the State of the Union reports that the committee has under consideration H.R. 1582 and has come to no resolution thereon. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, the Chair will postpone further proceedings today on the motions to suspend the rules on which a recorded vote or the yeas and nays are ordered, or on which the vote incurs objection under Clause 6 of Rule 20. Recorded votes on postponed questions will be taken later.
For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, I move the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 1897 as amended.
The clerk will report the title of the resolution.
H.R. 1897, a bill to promote freedom and democracy in Vietnam.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from California, Mr. Royce, and the gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
Madam Speaker, I'm going to ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks.
Without objection.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. And I'm going to yield myself such time as I might consume. And this bill, which we rise in support of, H.R. 1897, is the Vietnam Human Rights Act of 2013, and it is authored by the chairman of the Africa Global Human Rights and Health Subcommittee, Mr. Smith, Mr. Chris Smith of New Jersey. And I thought I would just take a moment and, as prelude, talk about the efforts that Mr. Smith has put over the years, not just to the issue of human rights, but in particular identifying those most at risk, identifying those who are held captive in prison, and taking the personal effort to go and try to visit them in these horrible conditions which they find themselves in. I remember him saying to me once, can you imagine what it is like for someone who's a prisoner because he attempts to speak out for some modicum of free speech or for religious liberty, and he finds himself there in confinement, not knowing when they open that door, when they come for you, what they might do to you next, not knowing what type of torture might be applied. It takes a strong constitution for a member of this House, year after year after year, to continue to go to bat for those who are held in captivity, those who are subject to show trials and then disappear. And part of his efforts has been to pass this particular legislation because he's concerned with the magnitude of what is happening in Vietnam, but also what he has seen in his own eyes with respect to some of those victims. Over the years, the Foreign Affairs Committee has held many hearings on this subject. And if these hearings have had one consistent theme, it's the deterioration of human rights. And I think this is the thing we really find most regrettable, that at a time when we hoped that Vietnam might change its policies, it actually has regressed. And we've heard from the witnesses of the use of the government by government agents, by militias, some call them thugs, who use everything from electric batons to metal prods to beat those who are demonstrating in Vietnam and who are in the process of speaking up for religious liberty or speaking up for the rights of free speech. And now it's gotten to the point that any young person who dares to blog those words, freedom of speech, those words, democracy, anyone who publishes material promoting democracy or criticizing totalitarian rule faces so many years in jail. It is so disproportionate, it is so ridiculous to put a young person in jail for 6 or 7 years because they blog on democracy. But the thing that I think Chris Smith and I and others here, Elliot Engel, find so objectionable is the physical abuse that they are also subject to in confinement. So, as we say, religious freedom is also under attack with freedom of speech. Residents of Can Yo, Da Nang, have suffered severe violence. I've seen some of the photographs of the consequences of these beatings with batons and electric rods during a May assault at the hands, again, of Vietnamese government officials. And again, this was because the parishioners attempted to protect their historic Catholic cemetery from seizure by the government. We have over 350 Montagnard Christians who remain imprisoned for their beliefs, and other religious groups. When I was in Vietnam, I talked to the leader of the Unified Buddhist Church of Vietnam, the Venerable Thich Quang Do, who was under house arrest, and Lee Quang Liam, another, well, he was the leader of the of the Wahao Buddhists at the time. He has subsequently, in a protest, been beaten so badly I don't think he can carry on a conversation today. The Cao Dai Buddhists face severe persecution from the government, the communist government there. So, what brings us here tonight is that Vietnam has actually taken steps backwards. As we heard from the witnesses who testified before our committee, in the first 6 weeks of this year, 40 dissidents have been convicted in show trials, more than all of last year. That's how bad things are deteriorating, and that means that the communist government is not only eclipsing their past bad performance, but paradoxically, the government is also actively pursuing a seat on the UN Human Rights Council. That is why we need to take this step, and why passage of the Vietnam Human Rights Act is so important, and why we've got to use what leverage we have. And part of that leverage is non-humanitarian U.S. assistance to Vietnam. And we do that unless the Vietnamese government improves its respect for human rights to meet specified requirements. Let's send a message to that regime that the status quo is unacceptable. This bill does that. I strongly urge its passage, and once again, I strongly commend and thank its author for his perseverance on this issue. And I will reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from California reserves his time. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I yield myself as much time as I might consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise in strong support of H.R. 1897. I'd like to thank the sponsor of this legislation, Mr. Smith of New Jersey, and once again thank the Chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Mr. Royce, for their leadership in advocating for human rights in Vietnam. Despite Vietnam's transition to a more open economy in recent years, political and religious freedoms for the people of Vietnam remain severely curtailed. Just last week, President Obama hosted the President of Vietnam for a visit. I was there for the luncheon at the State Department, and I'm pleased that he urged the Vietnamese leader to respect freedom of expression, freedom of religion, and freedom of assembly. At that very luncheon, I sat next to one of the Vietnam ministers and urged the same thing to him as well. As the United States and Vietnam build a closer and more cooperative relationship, we must continue to be candid in calling for more progress in protecting the human rights and civil liberties of the Vietnamese people. I certainly remember the Vietnam War, as I know many of my colleagues do, and it seems a bit strange that the United States and Vietnam are in many ways allied and working together. That's fine. But human rights is so important to us, and it's not something we can just sweep under the rug. This legislation, the Vietnam Human Rights Act of 2013, takes a step in the right direction by prohibiting an increase in non-humanitarian assistance to Vietnam above fiscal year 2012 levels unless the government of Vietnam makes significant progress on critical human rights issues. The bill makes it clear to Vietnam that the only factor limiting U.S. aid is positive action by the Vietnamese government on political, human, and religious rights. The government of Vietnam has an important choice to make. Will it protect human rights and provide religious and political freedom to its citizens, or will it shirk those responsibilities and forsake the closer relationship that it wants with the United States? Again, I think a closer relationship with Vietnam is something that I would like to see. But you know what? We have principles, and the Vietnamese have to respect those principles. We respect them. They need to respect us. So I urge my colleagues to support this legislation, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I yield such time as he may consume to the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Smith, Chairman of the Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health, Global Human Rights, and International Organizations, and the author of this bill.
The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Madam Madam Chair, as well. And I want to thank, first of all, you for your very kind remarks, but also for moving this legislation very swiftly through the full committee, along with Elliot Engel's full support, and the Chairwoman Emeritus, Eliana Ross-Layton. Thank you for your steadfast support for human rights, now presiding over this session. And Mr. Chairman, I do want to thank you for being a champion on behalf of the dissidents, the bloggers, the religious dissidents, political and religious, in Vietnam who suffer daily beatings at the hands of an increasingly absurd and worsening dictatorship. Vietnam is in a race to the bottom with some of the dictatorships around the world, including Cuba, including China, Somalia, and other places where people's human rights are systematically trashed by the regimes. I do ask respectfully that members support the Vietnam Human Rights Act of 2013. The purpose of this bipartisan legislation is simple: to send a clear, strong, and compelling message to the increasingly repressive communist regime in power in Vietnam that says that the United States is serious about combating human rights abuse in Vietnam. Underscoring the worsening situation in Vietnam, John Sifton of Human Rights Watch testified at a June 4th hearing that I chaired, and he noted that, quote, in the first few months of 2013, more people have been convicted in political trials as in the whole of last year. And that has only gotten worse as each week passes in Vietnam. Reporters Without Borders have put out their number, and there is at least 35 netizens, bloggers, journalists who write online, who have been incarcerated by this dictatorship. I'll never forget on one particular trip to Vietnam, I met with Dr. Phan Song, met with his wife. He was in prison. And what was his crime? He wrote an embassy. He went on U.S. Embassy Hanoi, took a essay entitled "What is Democracy?" translated it and resent it out online, and for that he got a multi-year sentence in jail. I met with his wife, who lived in great fear that they would go after her as well, and certainly when I had dinner with her one night, sitting as far away as Chairman Royce at the next table at a hotel were three bully boys from the three thugs from the secret police of Vietnam, very visibly standing up and taking pictures to let us know that they were watching. Of course, I took their picture as well. But that's the kind of intimidation campaign this wonderful wife of a dissident was experiencing. The Boat People SOS suggests that there are well over 625 political prisoners and religious prisoners as we meet here tonight who are suffering. And of course, that number often goes up. One might be let out, two more incarcerated by this dictatorship. Madam Speaker, H.R. 1897 is designed to promote the development of freedom and democracy in Vietnam. The bill will bring much-needed scrutiny to a seriously deteriorating situation. It stipulates that the United States can increase non-humanitarian assistance to Vietnam above the 012 levels only if the President is able to certify that the government of Vietnam has made substantial progress in establishing a democracy and promoting human rights, including respecting religious freedom and the release of political prisoners and religious prisoners, repealing and revising laws that criminalize peaceful dissent, respecting the human rights of members of all ethnic groups. There's an enormous amount of racism in Vietnam, particularly directed at people who happen to be Montagnard and others. Taking all appropriate steps, including the prosecution of government officials to end government complicity in that nefarious practice called human trafficking. There are also other very clear benchmarks articulated in the legislation. Mr. Speaker, there's been a change at the chair. In the last 4 months alone, on April 11th and June 4th, I've held 2 more congressional hearings on this deteriorating situation. We heard stories about individuals and groups who are being persecuted in a variety of ways. Their testimony confirmed that religious, political, and ethnic persecution has worsened and that there is complicity by leadership by the people who are in the government of Vietnam in human trafficking. The U.S. Commission for International Religious Freedom in 2013 in their report noted, the government of Vietnam continues to expand control over all religious activities, severely restricting independent religious practice and to repress individuals and religious groups in its views as challenging their authority. The Commission says very candidly, Vietnam ought to be a country of particular concern, a CPC designation pursuant to the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998. Unfortunately, that was removed by President Bush, a misguided move on his part. In 2006, when there was thought that the bilateral trade agreement and the permanent normal trading relations might lead to a matriculation from dictatorship to democracy, things actually have gotten worse since this government got this trade benefit, and human rights have suffered, and people, real casualties, have endured unspeakable hardships. Mr. Chairman, on several human rights trips to Vietnam, I have met, as has Chairman Royce, as have other members, and I know when you meet these people, you are forever moved. Courageous leaders who struggle, sacrifice, and endure numbing hardships, including torture, to promote fundamental human rights in their beloved country. Many of these remarkable individuals hail from virtually every denomination of faith, whether it be Christian or Falun Gong or Buddhists, who suffer, again, horrifically because of their faiths. I met with the Venerable Thich Kwan Do under pagoda arrest, a great Buddhist leader who has been relegated to his pagoda. He can't step 1 foot outside of that pagoda without the secret police rushing in. He told me that if he took 1 step out with me to say goodbye, that there would be an onslaught of these bully boys who would push and shove and, worse, mistreat him. I met with Father Lee when he was under house arrest before being rearrested. Here's a great democracy activist who was being so callously mistreated by this dictatorship, and he is only one of many. It is not just the religious leaders in particular or individuals who are victimized by the government. Entire communities are also targeted by the regime. Mr. Tien Tran testified at our April 11th meeting and told my subcommittee of the brutality experienced by the Kundal Catholic Parish that has been repressed like you can't believe, Mr. Speaker. Individuals have been beaten to a pulp, some have died, and of course they have just confiscated their property, so they're kleptomaniacs as well. Also at the April 11th meeting, we heard from the sister of a Vietnamese woman who was forced to work in a brothel in Russia with 14 other Vietnamese women. When there was an effort made by the Russian government to invade, to liberate those women, it was the embassy of Vietnam in Moscow that tipped off the traffickers, because they were complicit with them, to ensure that these women were not liberated but continued to be hurt by the traffickers. In each of these cases, there was another one dealing with women who were trafficked to Jordan, and those officials of the Vietnamese government were complicit in that as well. And again, that's only a tip of the iceberg of this terrible complicity with heinous crimes against women. Unfortunately, the State Department, and I think politically, because otherwise the State Department report on trafficking was a good one, but they made a gross exception when it came to Vietnam and actually improved their grade when the information, even in the narrative about Vietnam in the TIP report, would have suggested otherwise. I'm the prime author of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act and worked to create those minimum standards. It's appalling that Vietnam is not where it ought to be, a Tier 3 country, an egregious violator, subject to sanctions. This will be the 4th time, if this bill passes, Mr. Speaker, that we've been able to get the Vietnam Human Rights Act passed. In 2004, 2007, and last year in 2012, iterations of this bill have gotten over to the Senate only to die through holds and other very non-democratic means of suppressing the will of the Senate in working on this bill. I hope that changes. We have seen a deterioration, as my colleagues and I have all pointed out tonight, in the human rights situation in Vietnam. It is time to stand with the oppressed people who are yearning to be free in Vietnam, and to stand up against this dictatorship. Yeah, meet with them, talk to the President, Tsang, as he was here last week to meet with President Obama. but lay down very specific benchmarks on simple respect for the fundamental liberties of people in Vietnam who just yearn to be free and to experience their God-given rights. I yield back the balance of my time to the distinguished chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from California reserves. Recognize the gentleman from New York.
Yeah, I reserve my time.
The gentleman from New York reserves.
Well, I'll make concluding remarks then at this time.
The gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I again want to thank my colleague, Mr. Smith from New Jersey, for his dedication to human rights in Vietnam and for his human rights in general, and for not only his work on this bill, but again, the time and energy that he has put in to attempting to intervene on behalf of those who have been subject to these beatings that he has cited, to this maltreatment, to these long prison terms. Last week we had the President of Vietnam, President Sang, here visiting Washington for the first official visit, I think, since '07. And while we've been assured that human rights were on the agenda during these meetings with the President and with the State Department, and of course we did all we could to make certain that this time they were on the agenda, but I think the Vietnamese people need more than talk, and that is why we need to pass this legislation. It's a sign to all Vietnamese people that the U.S. is committed to the cause of human rights, but it is also leverage that can be used to guarantee some measure of attention from the regime. This is Congress's chance to speak to those Vietnamese people who are yearning for freedom. It's our chance to do so by vocally supporting a human rights agenda in Vietnam, and we've got to get this back on the agenda. I strongly urge my colleagues to support this important bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. I recognize the gentleman from New York.
Yes, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 1897 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, two-thirds being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended. The bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table.
Mr. Speaker, we're going to request the yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor of taking this vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. A sufficient number having arisen, the yeas and nays are ordered pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 30. Further proceedings on this motion will be postponed.
Thank you, Chris. Appreciate it so much. Absolutely.
Okay. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I'm going to move at this time that the House suspend the rules and pass House Concurrent Resolution 41 as amended, the Encouraging Peace and Reunification on the Korean Peninsula legislation.
The clerk will report the title of the concurrent resolution.
House Concurrent Resolution 41, Concurrent Resolution Encouraging Peace and Reunification on the Korean Peninsula.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from California, Mr. Royce, and the gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel, will each control 20 minutes. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. I'm going to ask that all members may have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to begin this debate by yielding such time as he may consume to the author of this bill, the gentleman from New York, a hero of the Korean War, who served his country with valor during that tough campaign, and after surviving an onslaught by waves of Chinese troops, he led his surviving comrades, while wounded, to safety from behind enemy lines, for which he was awarded a Purple Heart and also a Bronze Star for Valor. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Charlie Rangel. I yield you such time as you may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I was prepared to respond to the chairman and ranking member for their legislative courtesies that they had extended to me, and I appreciate the tribute being paid to me, which unusually I awkwardly was unprepared for. But I do want to thank you for your friendship in more ways than just this resolution, as well as Tom Sheehy, who worked with your staff, and of course my friend in New York, who's J.J. Ong, the committee staff, and he guided to make certain that this almost legislative impossible resolution was so expediently brought up to be considered by this August House. On Saturday last, the President of the United States, with our congressional colleague who is now the Secretary of the Department of Defense and the Secretaries of all of the armed forces groups, got together to honor the veterans of the Korean War. It was a sight to see so many Korean veterans from so many different parts of the country, and they were reminded by our President that we had been labeled as those who participated in what was referred to as the Forgotten War, because most all of the world knew about the importance of America being involved in saving democracy in World War II, and Vietnam, for good or bad, everyone knew people that went there. But somehow in the middle of that, no one really missed us or knew where Korea was, or it didn't appear that there was too much concern. And when we did return, unlike the Vietnam veterans who really unfairly had been treated so unkind, fortunately for us, we were never missed except by our families and friends. People never knew where we were, and the Congress was not as kind to us as they had been to other veterans. Having said all of that, it was a wonderful tribute. Veterans turned out from all over, certainly comrades that were part of the 20 countries that were part of the United Nations. And when North Koreans invaded South Korea, those of us that were called to go to South Korea to defend them, we were going to a country that we never knew, to fight for a people that we never met, for causes that were not well known. Having said all of that, at the conclusion, and the war has never been really called a war, it has never been truce, it still is a division between these people. But as a result of the United States and the United Nations effort, as a result of millions of lives lost, 54,000 Americans, 100,000 Americans wounded, and close to 9,000 either captured or missing in action, one would say, with all of the blood and money, what did we get out of this? And that's what we discussed Saturday at the Korean War Veterans. What we got out of this was the integrity of the United States of America, that any commitment that we have made to the United Nations, not only would we be participating, but we would lead, as we did under the direction of General MacArthur. And today, as we look back and see that out of the rubbles of a country that had been reduced by war, and we take a look at what exists in the northern part, as this division still exists today, in communist North Korea, we have seen a people that had no jobs, no homes, no resources, but they did have hope. And out of this South Korean hope and dream came a nation, a new nation, a nation that demonstrated what democratic people can do. An economy was built, a friendship and a partnership with the United States and freedom-loving people all over the world. And so today, we just don't say as Korean veterans that we know where Korea is. We say that no matter how little a part we played, that we can look back and be proud as Americans that we have, in a small part, been possible to see this small nation become a world power, not only in terms of its military, but its friendship in terms of Americans' national defense, not only in terms of friendship, but being one of our wonderful trading partners that provides jobs for Koreans and Americans. And so it only makes sense, as a great country of ours that still has the scars of the Civil War, that we should want Koreans, North and South, to find some way to seek unity, to find some way to understand the values of democracy, to find some way that the thing that democracies are willing to fight and die for exists in that peninsula. I want to specifically thank Hannah Kim of my office for doing what staff does for all of us in getting people, even from the other body, to understand how important this was to the President and to the Congress. And of course to the Speaker's staff who worked closely with Chairman Ross. That's Mike Summers and Dave Schneider. And then on the other side of the Capitol, Ted Womack, Chief of Staff of Senator Corker, Mike Henry and his gang, Chief of Staff of Senator Tim Kaine. And on behalf of all of the veterans, I can tell you, as I yield back my time back to the Chairman, is that we all have felt that America really did love us. They just needed an opportunity to express it. So we thank you for this resolution, and it's not just for me and Korean, but it's also for Korean Americans. So many Asians, and especially Korean Americans, they love Korea, but they love our country best. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and we thank Mr. Rangel. And at this time, I would yield to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel.
The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Yes, I rise in support of House Concurrent Resolution 41 as amended, and I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Let me say, first of all, that I want to thank my colleague and friend from New York, Congressman Rangel, for his service to our country in the Korean War, also for his long service in the House of Representatives, and for offering this important resolution. If you grew up in New York, as I did, and you grew up in politics, everyone knows who Charlie Rangel is in any place in New York, New York City, or New York State. And now we actually have adjoining districts, back-to-back districts. And he obviously means so much to so many people, and I'm proud to call him my colleague, and even more proud to call him my friend. So I want to thank Congressman Rangel to sponsor this legislation. I want to thank our chairman, Ed Royce, for his leadership as well on this resolution. And what this does is that H-Con Res 41 recognizes the historical importance of the Korean War, which ended 60 years ago this past weekend. The resolution also affirms the strong bonds between the United States and the Republic of Korea, which were forged in blood during the Korean War. During that conflict, nearly 1.8 million American soldiers served in the theater to defend freedom and democracy, and sadly almost 55,000 were killed, over 100,000 were wounded, and about 8,000 were listed as missing in action or prisoners of war. So just as I thanked Congressman Rangel, my good friend, I want to also say that the House has other Korean War veterans in the House, Representative John Conyers, Representative Sam Johnson, and Representative Howard Coble. Charlie Rangel and all the other Korean War veterans in the House that I just mentioned all deserve our recognition and sincere thanks. From the ruins of that conflict 60 years ago, we've seen the rise of a strong alliance between the United States and South Korea, the emergence of South Korea as one of the major economies of the world and a leading trading partner of the United States. This past January, I visited South Korea with Chairman Royce, where we had an opportunity to meet South Korea's new president, and we also met her when she came here and spoke before a joint session of Congress a few months ago, and we also met with other senior officials when we were in Seoul. Based on these conversations, I can tell you that the U.S.-South Korea relationship has never been stronger. With the continued threat posed by North Korea, the U.S.-Korea alliance is needed more than ever to safeguard peace and stability in that region of the world. More than 28,000 American Armed Services personnel serve in Korea today, and Chairman Royce and I met many of those people when we were over in Korea. And just as Korea War veterans fought for freedom, so too do these current-day defenders stand ready to help protect freedom on the Korean Peninsula and throughout the region. So I urge my colleagues to support this resolution, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. Gentleman from California is recognized.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I would close my remarks by saying that I rise in strong support of this resolution, and I'd like to add my voice to others grateful for the sacrifices so many Americans made to protect the freedom of South Korea, and again to acknowledge the four members of this House, Congressman Charlie Rangel, John Conyers, Sam Johnson, Howard Coble, the veterans of that war, to thank them for their service in the armed forces, and to commend Congressman Rangel for offering this resolution here on the 60th anniversary of this special relationship that we have with South Korea. We recall that 22 nations came together to defend the Republic of Korea, and fighting stopped 3 years later with an armistice that still remains in place. 5.7 million Americans served during that conflict, and as noted, the casualties were 56,000 if you count those missing and presumed dead, and over 100,000 Americans wounded in that war. 140,000 South Koreans killed in action, and many of whom fought side by side with American forces for the cause of freedom. But when you calculate the more than 3 million Korean civilians killed in that conflict, you begin to appreciate the enormity of the human loss. The heroic deeds of these servicemen, both Korean and American, laid the foundation for that alliance that we speak of here that has lasted some 60 years, but also brought relative stability, as Mr. Rangel pointed out, to Northeast Asia, and certainly laid that foundation for the prosperity that we see in Seoul and around the country today. Yet Korea remains a divided peninsula. This is a calamity for the Korean people. The United States and South Korea have spent much of the last 20 years offering to engage North Korea with aid, with trade, with diplomacy, and all of these initiatives, unfortunately, have failed. And the North Korean response, besides its aggressive behavior towards South Korea, the regime there continues to develop nuclear weapons, to test missiles, to supply weapons to countries like Iran and Syria. Mr. Chairman, we've tried many strategies. I think only one has worked, really, and that was financial pressure. I recall in 2005 when an Undersecretary of the Treasury caught North Korea counterfeiting $100 bills. And so what he did was use the power of the U.S. financial system to cut off Kim Jong-il's access to his vast offshore wealth. And while the North Korean people were starving at the time, as you know, The country's dictator had billions of dollars stashed away in foreign banks. Suddenly, he did not have access anymore to that money when the sanctions were put on the Banco Delta Asia. And blocking those accounts denied Kim Jong-il the cash he needed to sustain that vast police state, to sustain that million-man army, to pay for his nuclear weapons and his luxurious lifestyle. And for a while, the world had his attention. For a while, he wanted to come back to the table. I think that approach worked. I suspect North Korea will only change when it's forced to change. And I think we must resurrect a successful strategy of financial pressure. But, Mr. Speaker, today what we do, what we dedicate ourselves to, is recognizing the 60th anniversary of the Armistice Agreement of the Korean War. And importantly, this resolution not only honors the service and sacrifices of the members of the armed forces, but it also reaffirms our commitment to the U.S.-Korea alliance. And this resolution sends a message that the U.S. goal remains that which thousands of Americans, including 4 of our members, fought for. That goal remains peace on the Korean Peninsula. I urge my colleagues to support this resolution, and I yield back the balance of my time, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you. Before I yield back, I want to thoroughly embarrass my colleague and friend from New York, because we found in our cloakroom this wonderful picture, and this good-looking guy is Charlie Rangel when he was a soldier in Korea. And now you know why he was elected to Congress. Anyone who looks that good, everyone votes for. So I think this is, it's nice to hold a picture of a hero. And let me say to my colleague,
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Dear colleague from New York.
Thank you. I yield back.
Back. For the record, that is. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and agree to House Concurrent Resolution 41? Those in favor as amended, 41 as amended. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended. The concurrent resolution is agreed to, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Gavel. The Chair announces the Speaker's appointment pursuant to Section 8162 of Public Law 106-79 as amended, and the order of the House of January 3, 2013, of the following members on the part of the House to the Dwight D. Eisenhower Memorial Commission.
Mr. Bishop of Georgia and Mr. Thompson of California.
The Chair lays before the House the following personal request.
Leave of absence requested for Mr. Meadows of North Carolina for Tuesday, July 30th, Mr. Miller of Florida for today after 6:00 p.m. and for the balance of the week, and Mr. Young of Florida for today.
Without objection, the requests are granted. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 3, 2013, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Olson, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Majority Leader.
Mr. Speaker, as a member of the House Energy Action Team, I want to open the special order by paying tribute to a man who made American energy independence possible in the 21st century, George Mitchell. Mr. Mitchell left us this past Friday. He was 94 years old, 6 years short of a century. He was truly a larger-than-life figure in Texas, America, and the world. He spent more than 20 years of his life risking tens of millions of his own dollars looking to unlock the natural gas and oil that he knew existed in shale plays all across this country. In the mid-1990s, Mr. Mitchell finally succeeded in tapping into the Barnett Shale play outside of Dallas-Fort Worth. He got his first operational well, profitable well, after 35 wells. The 36th one was the one that made the difference. The Barnett Shale play led to the Haynesville Shale play in western Louisiana and eastern Texas. That led to Marcellus Shale play in western New York, western Pennsylvania, and West Virginia. That led to the Bakken Shale play in North Dakota and eastern Montana. And that led back home to the Eagle Ford Shale play, south of San Antonio, going down to the Rio Grande border with Mexico. Mr. Mitchell came to this world with a very special title, B.O.I., Born on Island, a title of reverence for someone who's born on Galveston Island. He was born on May 21st, 1919. Galveston was still struggling to recover from America's worst natural disaster, the Galveston hurricane of 1900, in which at least 6,000 Americans died in one night in September of that year. But being B.O.I., Mr. Mitchell did not despair. He felt resurgence. He felt hope. He took that resurgence and hope to College Station and Texas A&M University, where he studied petroleum engineering and geology. He finished first in his class and was the captain of the varsity tennis team. Texas A&M gave him the tools he needed to succeed. He gave tools back to Texas A&M. He donated $4.2 million for a new Aggie tennis stadium and $35 million for 2 new physics buildings. When Alzheimer's took his wife of nearly 70 years, Cynthia, he gave the University of Texas Medical Branch in Galveston, Texas' oldest medical school, millions to study research like Alzheimer's. He gave $20 million for biomedical research at the MD Anderson Cancer Center and brought Dr. Stephen Hawking to Texas A&M to help with studying degenerative diseases like the one Dr. Hawking had that he overcame for most of his adult life. And George Mitchell literally built the Woodlands north of Houston, one of the fastest growing and safest communities in America. And George Mitchell has a very special place in my heart because my daughter Kate saw her idol, Taylor Swift, at the Cynthia Woods Mitchell Pavilion in the Woodlands. And Mr. Mitchell never forgot his hometown of Galveston, Texas. He had the vision to restore the Galveston Strand, bring the cruise ships back to Galveston, and starting a Mardi Gras celebration larger than New Orleans. George Mitchell was a visionary who tapped into American exceptionalism and left a lasting mark on Texas, America, and the world. George Mitchell gave my kids and every kid in America a very special gift, the gift of freedom that comes from knowing that a foreign nation cannot hurt our economy by taking away the oil and gas we need. I saw this firsthand in 1979. The Ayatollah had overthrown the Shah of Iran. The Shah came here to America in exile, being treated for cancer that ultimately took his life. The Arab world was not happy that we let the Shah come to America. And so OPEC took away every drop of oil that they'd been giving our country for over 20 years. I was 16 years old when that happened. I just got my driver's license. My job was to drive our Chevy Silverado down to pickup truck, down to the gas station, depending upon the last digit of my license plate, odd or even, and fill up the truck with a maximum of 20 gallons of gasoline. The price of that gasoline doubled overnight. Because of George Mitchell, American children will never have to go through that again if we continue to follow his dream of developing shale plays all across this great nation. George Mitchell embodies the qualities of hard work, innovation, compassion, and a can-do spirit that make America the greatest nation on earth. We are better off today because of George and Cynthia Mitchell. May God bless the Mitchell family, their 10 children, and everyone whose life was touched by their presence. In naval aviation, we say, "Bravo Zulu." Mr. Mitchell, bravo Zulu. You are cleared to depart the pattern and rejoin Cynthia in a life of shared eternity. Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back.